17 seconds doesn't sound like a long time. In a lifetime, it is a blink. In a conversation, it is a pause. But on live national television, under the glare of studio lights, with 12 million people watching from their living rooms, 17 seconds is an eternity. It is enough time for a career to die. It is enough time for an empire of lies to crumble. It is enough time for a man who thought he was the hunter to realize he has been the prey all along. This is the story of the silence that broke the machine. It is the story of the moment the most feared journalist in America sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, staring at a man he had come to destroy, realizing that his entire worldview was dissolving in real time. The date was November 3rd, 1980. The place was the fortress of CBS Studios. In New York City, the target was Bob Marley. And what happened in that studio has become a ghost story in the halls of media history, a moment whispered about but rarely understood. Welcome to Marley Files, the untold stories, where we dig past the vinyl and the posters to find the raw, beating heart of the legend. To understand the weight of this silence, you have to understand the noise that preceded it. The year 1980 was a time of hardening hearts. The optimism of the 60s was dead and buried. America was tightening its grip, turning toward conservatism, fearful of radicals, suspicious of outsiders, and declaring war on the very counterculture that had once promised liberation. Leading the charge in the media was a program that had become a Sunday night ritual for a nation, 60 Minutes. It was the televisual courtroom of American opinion. If you were seated in that guest chair, you were on trial. And the chief prosecutor, the man known as the executioner of reputations, was Richard Hayes. Hayes was 42 years old, a former state prosecutor who had traded the courtroom for the broadcast booth, but kept the killer instinct. He didn't conduct interviews. He conducted autopsies on the living. He was famous for the ambush, for the dossier of damaging facts pulled from under the desk, for the rapid-fire accusation that left senators and CEOs stammering. He was the attack dog of the establishment, convinced that everyone had a dirty secret and that he was the righteous hand of judgment. For 6 weeks, Hayes had been sharpening his knives for Bob Marley. To Hayes, Marley wasn't a musical icon. He was a threat. He saw a foreign agitator, a man with wild hair and a strange religion, whose rhythms were seducing American teenagers into a world of drug use and anti-government rebellion. In the production meetings leading up to the broadcast, Hayes had been explicit with his team. He called Marley a fraud. He called him a wolf in sheep's clothing. He told his producers that he was going to strip away the One Love facade and expose the dangerous radical underneath. He had done his homework. He had stacks of police reports, lyrics about burning and looting, and testimony from disgruntled former associates claiming the spiritual image was nothing but a marketing hustle. Hayes walked into that studio on November 3rd believing he was about to perform a public service. He believed he was the good guy. The atmosphere inside Studio 3 was sterile and cold, a vacuum of air-conditioned silence designed to make guests feel small. The cameras were heavy mechanical eyes. The lights were uncomfortably bright. Into this artificial world walked Bob Marley. By November 1980, Bob was already walking with death. Though few knew how close it was, the cancer was in his body, a silent clock ticking down his final months. This proximity to the end gave him an aura that was almost otherworldly. He wasn't just a musician anymore. He was a man who had already detached from the petty fears of this life. He wore a dark suit, simple but elegant, his dreadlocks resting on his shoulders like a mantle. He carried himself not with the arrogance of a rock star, but with the quiet, terrifying calm of a prophet who has seen the other side. His management had told him this was a standard promotional chat for the Uprising tour. Bob didn't know he was walking into a trap, but looking back, it seems unlikely it would have mattered if he did. When you are fighting for your soul, a TV interview is a small thing. The makeup room, the contrast between the two men was absolute. Hayes was a coil of nervous energy, reviewing his attack plan, checking his angles, watching Bob through the mirror with the eyes of a predator. The makeup artist, touching up Bob's face, whispered to Hayes about how calm and kind the musician seemed. Hayes just sneered. He whispered back that it was all a mask, a performance that ended the moment the hard questions began. He was convinced that he could break Bob Marley. He was convinced that beneath the calm exterior was a hypocrite waiting to be exposed. At 8:00 p.m., the red tally lights on the cameras flared to life. 12 million households were watching. The trap was sprung. Ayaz began with his signature gravity, looking into the lens and framing the narrative before Bob had even spoken a word. He introduced Bob not as an artist, but as a question mark, a potential danger to the moral fabric of the nation. He turned to Bob and the interrogation began. There was no warm-up. Hayes went straight for the throat. He brought up Babylon. He demanded to know if Bob was inciting American children to rise up against their own government. He wielded the lyrics like evidence in a murder trial, twisting the metaphors of Rastafari into literal threats of treason. He expected Bob to get defensive. He expected a denial, a stutter, or a flash of anger. That's what always happened. When you corner a man, he fights back. But Bob didn't fight. He didn't raise his voice. He sat in the chair, grounded and serene, and offered a perspective that Hayes's binary mind couldn't process. Bob explained that Babylon wasn't a place on a map. It wasn't the White House or the Capitol. It was a spiritual condition. It was any system anywhere on Earth that placed profit above human dignity. He spoke of mental slavery. He spoke of systems that trapped the soul. Hayes, frustrated that his opening salvo hadn't drawn blood, pivoted to drugs. He laid out the accusations of corrupting the youth, of promoting illegal substances under the guise of religion. He asked if Bob was nothing more than a drug pusher with a guitar. Again, Bob refused to step into the ring on Hayes's terms. He spoke of the herb as a sacrament, a tool for looking inward, comparable to the wine in a communion cup. He spoke of freedom, not the freedom to break laws, but the freedom of the individual to find their own path to the divine. The tension in the control room was palpable. Hayes was losing control of the interview, not because he was being outshouted, but because he was being outthought. He decided to escalate. He pulled out the folder of damning lyrics. He quoted Burnin' and Luton, practically shouting the words, accusing Bob of advocating for violence and destruction. This was the moment Hayes felt sure he would win. How could anyone defend a song about looting? Bob's expression shifted, but not to anger. A profound sadness washed over his face. He leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and explained that he wasn't prescribing violence. He was describing despair. He was a reporter from the front lines of poverty. He explained that when people are hungry, when they are voiceless, when the pressure of injustice becomes too great for the human spirit to bear, the city burns. He wasn't telling people to light the match. He was begging the world to notice the gasoline on the floor. Hayes was rattled. His weapons were turning into dust. Every accusation he threw was met with a wall of philosophical water that absorbed the blow and reflected it back. Desperate, Hayes went for the character assassination. He looked Bob in the eye and called him a fraud. He cited the anonymous sources. He accused Bob of manufacturing his spirituality to sell records to naive white kids. He asked with a sneer what it felt like to deceive millions. This was the point where the interview was supposed to end in a shouting match. This was the climax Hayes had scripted. But Bob Marley didn't follow the script. He stopped. He looked deep into Richard Hayes, past the suit, past the makeup, past the years of cynicism. And then he did the unthinkable. He started asking the questions. Bob asked Hayes what he believed in. He asked what gave his life meaning. He asked why a man would spend his life trying to tear others down. Hayes, caught off guard, stammered that he was the one asking the questions, that he was the guardian of truth. But the dynamic had shifted. The prisoner had taken control of the prison. Bob leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper that the microphones barely caught, but which roared through the studio speakers. He asked Hayes if he had ever actually listened to the music. Not listened for evidence, not listened for crime, but listened to the message. He asked if Hayes had ever tried to understand the pain and the hope that fueled the songs, or if he had only ever looked for things to fear. And then came the question that stopped time. Bob looked at the journalist and asked, "Richard, you have spent tonight trying to prove I am not what I appear to be. But what if the real question is, are you what you appear to be?" That was the moment. The camera held on Richard Hayes's face. He opened his mouth to retort, to fire back another prepared zinger, but the words died in his throat. The question had bypassed his intellect and struck something deep and neglected in his soul. Are you what you appear to be? Hayes saw himself. He saw the years of destroying people for sport. He saw the cynicism that he had worn like armor until it had fused with his skin. He saw that he wasn't a guardian of truth. He was a gatekeeper of fear. He saw that he had become the very thing he claimed to despise. A fraud, playing a role, selling a version of reality that kept people angry and divided. The silence began. 1 second. 2 seconds. The producers in the booth were screaming into his earpiece. Richard, say something. Cut to commercial. Richard. But Hayes didn't hear them. He was in a free fall. 5 seconds. 10 seconds. On television screens across America, viewers leaned in. Was the audio broken? Had the signal failed? No, the picture was crisp. They were watching a man deconstruct. They were watching the mask fall. Hayes looked at his notes, the carefully typed questions, the highlighted accusations, and they looked like the scribblings of a madman. 15 seconds, 16 seconds, 17 seconds, 17 seconds of dead air. In the history of broadcasting, it is a glitch. In the history of the human soul, it was a baptism. Bob didn't interrupt the silence. He held the space. He watched Hayes with compassion, not triumph. He wasn't trying to win a debate. He was trying to save a man. When Bob finally spoke, he didn't gloat. He offered a hand. He spoke about motivation. He explained that he sang about the darkness because it was real, and he sang about the light because it was necessary. He asked Hayes what his motivation was. Did destroying people on live TV make the world better? Or did it just make Hayes feel powerful for an hour? The Richard Hayes who spoke next was not the man who had started the hour. His posture had collapsed. The aggression was gone. His voice was shaky, stripped of its professional baritone. He looked at Bob Marley, and for the first time in his career, he apologized. He admitted he was wrong. He asked if they could start over. He asked Bob to teach him. For the remaining 20 minutes of the program, the attack dog was gone. In his place was a student. Hayes asked genuine questions about the Rastafari faith, about the history of Jamaica, about the philosophy of one love. He listened. He learned. He let Bob speak without interruption. Viewers at home witnessed a miracle. They saw the alchemy of nonviolence in action. They saw how aggression, when met with absolute truth and kindness, dissolves. Bob Marley didn't defeat Richard Hayes. He transformed him. As the credits rolled, Hayes turned to the camera and delivered a sign-off that was never written on the teleprompter. He told the world that he had learned a lesson about journalism and about humanity. He admitted that seeking to understand is a higher calling than seeking to destroy. He thanked Bob Marley for the grace to show him the difference. His moment buried in the archives is more than just a piece of television trivia. It is a testament to the power of the vibration that Bob Marley carried. It shows us that the rebel music wasn't just about fighting against the police or the politicians. It was about fighting the hardening of the human heart. It was about confronting the Babylon inside of us, the part of us that judges, that fears, that divides. Bob walked into the lion's den and didn't raise a sword. He simply turned on a light, and the lion realized it was fighting a shadow. You often remember Bob Marley for the concerts, for the anthems that fill stadiums, for the icon on the t-shirt. But here at Marley Files, the Untold Stories, we believe the true measure of the man is found in moments like these. Moments where the music stopped and the spirit took over. Moments where a silence spoke louder than a scream. We live in a world that is louder than ever. A world full of Richard Hayeses, people convinced they are right, armed with accusations, ready to tear down anything they don't understand. It is easy to shout back. It is easy to meet anger with anger. But the lesson of November 3rd, 1980, is that there is a different way. There is a power in knowing who you are so deeply that no accusation can shake you. There is a power in holding up a mirror to your enemy and inviting them to see themselves. The studio lights dimmed that night. Bob Marley gathered his things and walked out into the cool New York air, back to his life, back to his illness, back to the mission that was consuming his remaining days. He left Richard Hayes sitting in the dark, a man dismantled and reassembled, holding a folder of useless notes. The silence of those 17 seconds still rings out today, asking us the same question Bob asked that night. When you strip away the job, the anger, the fear, and the mask, are you what you appear to be? His story is a reminder that the revolution Bob Marley sang about wasn't just in the streets. It was in the mind. It was in the eyes of a journalist who forgot how to see, until a Rasta man showed him how to look. If this story resonated with you, if you felt the weight of that silence, then you are part of this journey with us. We uncover these moments because they shape who we are. They remind us that the legend was a man, and the man was a light. Keep digging with us. Keep listening. And most importantly, when the noise of the world gets too loud, remember the power of the silence. One love.